If you live in a rural community in the United States, you're more likely to die from heart disease, cancer, giving birth, or suicide than if you live in a suburb or a city. You'll probably travel farther to see a doctor or get to a hospital during a health emergency. And it's not just healthcare that's harder to come by. Public transportation, well-funded schools, and affordable lawyers are too. You may be among the 1 in 4 rural Americans who don't have internet at all, but if you do, it's more likely to be slower internet, which means that you and your kids have less access to things like distance education and telemedicine, which are all the more important these days. These things probably aren't a surprise to you. We hear a lot about how rural communities have been left behind. And most stories about rural decline act like economic markets have organically led to this isolation and suffering, as if rural decline were inevitable, the result of forces of nature. But I'm a law professor, and my research undercuts that idea. The challenges faced by America's rural communities are not natural or inevitable. Rural decline has been driven by legislative and regulatory decisions over time where rural losses were a foreseeable trade-off. Over the past few decades, policymakers chose things like cheap energy, cheap food, and corporate power over the well-being of rural Americans. And to reverse the downward trajectory of rural opportunity, our policymakers need to do more, especially at the federal level. Let's begin with cheap energy. Energy is not cheap. It's just that the costs of producing it are happening far from where most of us live. And what's out of sight is often out of mind. I wasn't fully aware of the costs of energy when I began working at a law clinic in West Virginia during my time as a graduate fellow focused on community development. My education there into the impacts of coal mining on the Appalachian region was eye-opening and shocking. I learned about mine owners being allowed to skirt federal safety regulations for years, letting miners die in horrific accidents and only getting slaps on the wrist. I also learned about black lung. Black lung is a preventable disease that miners get from inhaling dust. It's killed thousands of miners, slowly suffocating them to death over the course of years. I also learned about the Black Lung Benefits Act, a program Congress passed to help miners with black lung. And that sounded good, but then I learned about the doctor at Johns Hopkins who consulted on 1,700 cases where miners said they had black lung, and he concluded that not a single one of them did. Evidence that coal companies relied on to deny miners benefits. In fact, the US Department of Labor granted miners those benefits in less than 8% of applications in the 90s. I also learned about mountaintop removal coal mining, where the tops are blasted off mountains and hazardous waste is dumped into valleys. Mountaintop removal is legal under federal environmental regulations, even though it causes serious health problems for people living nearby and ruins water sources and flattens landscapes forever. So common were the stories of coal company representatives filing false reports about water quality that I didn't drink the tap water for the 2 years that I lived in West Virginia. And once we were running low on coal, we moved on to natural gas. And we've seen similar legislative failures with the hydraulic fracturing of shale gas, also known as fracking. Around 2007, fracking experienced a boom. New technology let natural gas companies drill more deeply, more affordably. Even though this type of drilling was so new and potentially hazardous, Congress barely regulated it. No new law was passed specifically to deal with fracking, and Congress even exempted it from most of the major federal environmental protection statutes. Fracking isn't something that happens in cities. You need a well pad with a large footprint, a lot of water, waste storage, and drilling equipment. So it's something that's mostly affected rural communities, and most of those communities are poor. Poor communities have been told by drilling companies and the policymakers that support them that fracking is safe, its dangers exaggerated, and that fracking would revitalize struggling economies. Some rural communities have experienced a boom, but with extractive economies, there's almost always a bust. Meanwhile, fracking has brought water contamination and air pollution and increased health problems, including birth defects, and even earthquakes. These loose regulations for mining and shale gas extraction are not forces of nature. They're value-based decisions that prioritize cheap energy over the health of people and the environment. A second example of federal policy valuing questionable collective gains over rural welfare is in agriculture. Over the past few decades, the message of US agricultural policy has been get big or get out. In the 1920s, our country had over 6 million farms. Today, we have about 2 million. The average farm size has more than doubled, and concentrated farm ownership by large agribusiness corporations has become dominant. Federal ag policy has driven these changes in a few ways. Early 20th century policies protected small farmers with measures like price and income supports and limits on overproduction, but most of those policies have been dismantled. For example, the Federal Agriculture Improvement and Reform Act reduced those benefits to farmers, including the price and income supports and other measures that helped even the playing field and prevent concentrated farm ownership. Consolidated, heavily industrialized agriculture has a lot of negative impacts on rural communities. This type of farming brings serious environmental problems and reduces the number of farm jobs. As farms consolidate, it puts smaller farms out of business and rural communities empty out. Places that used to have diversified farm ownerships, where families would live and kids would go to school, become unlivable staging grounds for industrial production with an exploited labor force. In a recent interview with The New Yorker, a Wisconsin dairy farmer said, "It's not really even farming anymore, it's mining. We're extracting resources and we're shipping them away, and they're not coming back. There's no cyclical nature to it, it's a straight line out." The 1980s farm crisis was also a turning point when millions of farmers lost their farms. Federal institutions played a big role in the mass displacement of that period. During the 1970s, a government lender called the Farm Home Administration issued a lot of loans to farmers, while federal ag and tax policies encouraged investment in agriculture. But in 1979, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates to levels that hadn't been seen since the Civil War, up to a high of 21.5% in 1981. Farmers depend on credit to acquire land and get equipment and fertilizer and other supplies and labor. But suddenly, in 1979, all that debt was way more expensive for farmers, which they owed to the Farm Home Administration and other creditors. With many farmers unable to pay back the loans they needed, a lot of them couldn't keep their land. And again, the playing field was tilted in favor of large agribusiness operations with more resources. The main justification we get for farm consolidation is cheap food and crops for export. But there was a value judgment in this trade-off too. The judgment that we don't need farm ownership equitably distributed, that we don't need to help farm communities survive, and that we don't need to craft policies that support more sustainable farming. My first two examples have been about two major traditional sectors of the rural economy: natural resource extraction and farming. This third example is even more expansive and concerns almost every rural community in the United States. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a federal agency known as the Interstate Commerce Commission made sure that rural communities had equitable, affordable access to train, bus, and airline transportation. In 1929, almost every rural community in the country had access to passenger train service, and you could travel from Maine to Florida on a train without switching trains. Congress created the Interstate Commerce Commission in part because it knew transportation service providers would discriminate against rural communities because of higher costs and lower returns in rural places. But in the 60s and 70s, an idealized notion of market competition and small government got popular in some circles, and a movement of lawyers, economists, and transportation industry representatives pushed for less public control of transportation. This movement to deregulate the transportation industry won out in the form of a series of laws passed mostly in the 70s and 80s that let transportation service providers stop service to rural communities. Losing access to transportation means losing access to commerce, tourism, and other forms of economic growth. For example, in a survey conducted in the 80s of 500 leading businesses at the time, 80% said they wouldn't locate in a place that didn't have easy access to air transportation. Deregulating the transportation industry was supposed to make it more efficient and more affordable to consumers, and maybe it did, but there was a value judgment in this trade-off too. The judgment that protecting rural communities mattered less than increasing profits for transportation service providers and lowering costs for urban consumers. Passing laws and policies that value cheap energy over health and the environment, cheap food over a sustainable and equitable distribution of farm ownership, and supposedly efficient transportation over equitable access to transportation, that's a big part of how we got here. Rural decline isn't an act of God. It's the result of our choices. Now is the time to choose a more sustainable and equitable path forward. The transformation of rural America over the past few decades has been huge and complicated, and there's no perfect silver bullet for fixing all of the challenges that rural communities face today. But with rural community development, the goal is to stop the downward cycle and start an upward cycle. And there is a science to doing that. It is achievable with the right support at the federal, state, and local level. Right now, the bulk of federal support available for rural revitalization is through the Department of Agriculture in the form of grants that help rural communities do important local projects like building a courthouse or a child care center. Other federal agencies have rural grant programs too, like the National Park Service's grant to help rural communities preserve historic buildings. These are a good start. What these grant programs get right is that many of them are focused on long-term planning and important resources like economic diversification and education and local infrastructure and housing security. But we need to do more. Large-scale federal intervention has a lot of potential to make a big difference here. New federal legislation, specifically targeting rural decline, should take a few important steps. First, we need to restore rural access to infrastructure to reduce rural isolation and get rural communities reconnected back to the rest of the country. I've already talked about transportation, and that's one important point. Other priorities include reopening rural hospitals and recognizing broadband internet as a public utility that needs to be more widely distributed. Second, we need new federal legislation to create more ethical and sustainable food and energy systems. Our agricultural policies can start evening the playing field again for small and diversified farmers by reducing subsidies to large agribusiness operations, creating programs that remove barriers to entry for farmers of color and young farmers, and cracking down on unsustainable conventions like unethical labor practices, activities with high carbon emissions, and the inhumane and unhealthy treatment of livestock. Our energy policies can take similar steps. We need to reduce carbon emissions in the energy sector quickly, which means that we need more sources of renewable energy, which tend to be built on large stretches of rural land. We also need to do more to remediate land and water sources that have been damaged and made dangerous by fossil fuel extraction. A public green jobs and infrastructure program would provide a much-needed boost to distressed rural regions while also helping to decarbonize the energy sector. High-impact action is also possible at the state level. For example, it's been really helpful where some states have facilitated partnerships between their university systems and rural communities. When I started teaching at the University of South Carolina, I started my own law clinic, modeled after my experience in West Virginia. At the University of South Carolina Environmental Law Clinic, we've been privileged to work with rural clients on important issues of justice and rural development, like the loss of land by rural African Americans. Another example is our new pro bono mobile law program, which will be housed in a bus called the Palmetto Leader, and which will help provide legal assistance to South Carolina's rural residents. These are actionable steps that reflect an opportunity to do the right thing when we've been doing the wrong thing for so long. Law and policy are major factors in determining society's winners and losers. They're how we as a society choose to treat different groups. A lot of our laws and policies have left rural communities behind, but that doesn't mean that they have to. Rural decline is not an act of God. It's an act of people based on our values as we implemented them through law. It's time to rethink those values and pursue a better vision for rural communities based on sustainability, fairness, and mutual dependence. Thank you.